Welcome to Bible study. This is the Bible study we're preparing for St. Michael's Lutheran Church in Portland, Oregon on the fifth Sunday after Epiphany. That's February 4th, 2024. We hope and pray that this finds you well. If you have a Bible in front of you or handy, I'd encourage you to grab that. We're going to be looking today in the 14th chapter of the book of Acts. It is Paul's first missionary journey, and Paul and Barnabas have started off on the island of Cyprus. They have made the journey over to the mainland, what is today southeastern Turkey, and they've had some rather interesting adventures so far. They've had some people who have heard and believed, but they have also run into some people who have rejected their message and who have risen up in opposition to them and have stirred up opposition against them. We're going to want to talk a little bit about what we think that opposition is, but let's first look at the text and see what happens now on the second leg and the return leg of their first missionary journey. They had left from the city of Antioch in Pisidia off to the city of Iconium. Now at Iconium, it says, they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. Does Luke suggest they're maybe getting better at this? Maybe. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. And so they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of that city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. And there they continued to preach. So at Iconium, they have success, but again, the jealousy, the hostility of the local Jewish old line population, old believers, in conjunction with stirring up local opposition, create a situation where Paul and Barnabas again have to flee, although this time it seems to have taken a little longer. Now at Lystra, when they got there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth, and he had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul looked intently at him, and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And this man sprang up and began walking. I mean, you think about that. This man had never walked before. I mean, that's something we have to learn how to do. All of that in a moment. The people are naturally amazed by this. They've lived with this man begging, probably, by their gate for who knows how long. And now, simply because Paul of Tarsus has said, "Get up," the man can walk. They lifted up their voices, and they said in the Lycaonian language, and this is one of the things we oftentimes forget about the Roman Empire, is it was a polyglot, multiracial, multi-ethnic place. And there were lots of local dialects and languages that a lot of people who didn't live in that immediate area would not have been able to speak. Almost everybody knew how to handle themselves in Greek and in Latin, maybe a little bit, maybe not as much. But they also would have been able probably to speak a local dialect. And in this part of the world, they may have also spoken a variant of Aramaic. Many of these people would have been polylingual with maybe 4 or 5 different languages. They cried out in the language of the Laconians, "The gods have come down in the likeness of men." They have maybe made the observation Luke wants all of us to make, that when those Christians show up and they start preaching and they start doing these things, there's more than them that is there. Remember, we've been saying all along that the ascension of Jesus was not about his absence, but it was about a change in his presence. And that if you wanted to see Jesus, you looked to his people and you saw them doing the miracles, the very same things that Jesus did, speaking his words. And even when they died, like Stephen, they looked like him. Here, they properly identify this is more than a man. But they misidentify what more than a man it is. They think it is, in fact, Zeus and Hermes, gods from the Greek pantheon. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer a sacrifice along with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, when they kind of sussed out what was going on, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations he allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering a sacrifice to them. But Jews came from Antioch, it says, and Iconium, the two places they had just come from. Not content with driving Paul and Barnabas out, they followed and persuaded the crowds. They stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. And the disciples gathered about him, you can imagine, in grief and terror at what had just transpired. He rose up and entered the city, and on the next day went on with Barnabas to Derbe. A little black and blue, maybe? Rose up. And these people they didn't have a funeral home industry like we have. When someone died in your family, that was your responsibility, and you took care of that body, and you prepared it, and you buried it. They knew what death looked like. And if you have ever been around somebody who has died, the corpse, they have a peculiar look to them. Was Paul raised from the dead? The word there is he rose up. It's an interesting question. They went on to preach the gospel to that city in Derbe, and they had made many disciples. They returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch. All these places that had driven them out, they came back. What they had actually done is made something of a hook, they made an arc, and then they came back and revisited all of the places they had been to. They strengthened the souls of the disciples and encouraged them to continue in the faith, saying that through many tribulations, and this I think is a really important phrase for this chapter, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. All of the persecution, all of the opposition, being stoned and left for dead, did not dissuade or discourage Paul of Tarsus. The message that Luke has developed earlier in the book, in which he has said, you can persecute these people, but it's not gonna work. Remember the disciples, after they had been beaten for talking about Jesus by the Sanhedrin, left praising God that they had been given the honor of suffering for the name. They appointed elders for them in every church, leadership. They set up structure. Sometimes people don't like organized religion, but I find that that's what's the alternative? With prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Then they passed through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia, and when they had spoken a word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. And from there, Attalia is the port, they sailed on a boat to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. So they go back to their home congregation. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they remained no little time with the disciples. I think it's important at this juncture to stop and pause and consider for a few moments what it is that Luke is doing with all of this. You'll notice that in almost every place that Paul and Barnabas go, they meet with opposition. And Luke we already have pointed out that the opposition does not overwhelm, discourage, or turn them away. They flee. They run away from it on a couple of times. They move on, but it does not shut them up. But I think Luke also is telling us some other things about the opposition. And here we have to ask some questions about who do we think is actually reading this book initially that Luke has in mind. A lot of people imagine that it may have been a Roman of some stature. He does call him most excellent Theophilus at the beginning. And if this was maybe a governor or somebody in authority, or perhaps even the emperor himself, for remember, Theophilus simply means a friend of God. Then it may well be that Luke is really trying to tell them something about the nature of the charges that have been brought against Paul. That these are unreasonable, that these are motivated by a unreasonable religious prejudice that some people are bringing against him, but that they are finding traction in the local government, in the local leaders, it says, and that swirling controversy that has been surrounding the Apostle Paul for many years at this point. We need to be able to say, why is that happening? And it really seems that Luke wants you to understand that this opposition, this very real opposition, which has resulted in a mob of people picking up stones and throwing them at Paul until they thought he was dead, and dragging his body out of the city and leaving him there, that opposition is fundamentally irrational on their part. They have no good reason for it. It's not a legal problem. Paul is not doing anything illegal. It is being occasioned by simply this animus, this prejudice, this hatred of him and this message. And that the reasonable reader of the text, the person who is somebody that is a person who is just reading this with a reasonable, sensible outlook, is going to come to the conclusion that this persecution of Paul, this opposition that has been raised against him, these tumults that have arisen around him, this does not make any sense. This is not something that one should say that was a good idea. In fact, one should say that it is irrational. It is prejudicial. It is a bigotry, and it ought to be rejected. Next chapter, as we go into chapter 15, Luke is going to give us a theological reason for why we should reject that opposition. But we already are coming into it with this in hand, that it is not born out of rational arguments made against him. It is born out of something else. I look forward to picking this up with you next week. If you can come and talk to me about any of this on Sunday, look forward to it. God bless you. We'll see you soon.